So the way that we've designed this agenda to explore public safety through the lens of broken windows is to begin, obviously, with Ralph Mangual set the stage through his keynote. Our second panel was looking more through the lens of scholarship and academic research, both on the legal side as well as the sociological and the criminological sides of these issues. Now we're going to move to a discussion with practitioners. The title of this panel, Broken Windows at Street Level, is going to look at the theory of broken windows actually in practice. And we certainly touched on some of those things in the last panel, but very excited to have these public policy, public safety practitioners on the panel here as we look at what broken windows looks like at street level. I'll introduce the panelists very quickly. First, to my left, John McKinney is Deputy in Charge for the East Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. Matt Ross is the Executive Director of Californians Against Retail and Residential Theft, so bringing more of an activist lens to this. And finally, Shelley Zimmerman, who's the former police chief for the city of San Diego. Shelley has been great in engaging with our students, has taught classes with us at the policy school, as we've been delighted to have the former mayor of San Diego, Kevin Faulconer, serve as a visiting faculty member with us over the last few years. And so in particular, Shelley, great to have you back. Moderating this panel is my good friend, John Wood Jr. John is the national ambassador for Braver Angels. He is a longtime friend. John and I first met on the campaign trail back in 2014 as he was running for Congress and I was running for Secretary of State. The disposition and results of those two races are why we're both here and not in Congress nor the Secretary of State's office, but still flying the flag for peace, freedom, and America's founding principles. Again, I hope you're tracking questions as we go along through this panel. I know that there's going to be some provocative things said here, which I look forward to hearing and moderated so eloquently, I know, by my friend John Wood Jr. Please join me in welcoming up John.
Thank you very much to the Pepperdine School of Public Policy and to our panelists, who I'm pleased to meet, interact with. And yes, I look forward to having a fantastic conversation here. If folks will permit me, just a point of privilege here before we get into the meat of the conversation. I would like to say a little bit about why this conversation matters to me, because I was contemplating a little bit my own selection as shepherd of this particular part of the discourse today. And I'm a person who knows less by way of specialty than any of the folks up here on the stage. But like all of us in different ways, and in my own particular way, we live out the consequences of the policies that ensure or do not ensure public safety, the safety of our communities and our families. And we all live out the consequences of the social and political environment that leads to various trends and patterns emerging that wind up having real-world consequences. I'm somebody who lives more or less on the outskirts of the hood, so to speak. As Pete mentioned, we met way back in 2014. I was a Republican nominee for Congress running against Maxine Waters in that election cycle. I live with my wife and my 3 kids just outside of Inglewood, sort of Century, Crenshaw area or whatnot, an area that is quickly developing. Gentrification is a word that you hear quite a bit, but part of what you would hope would come with that is a responsiveness on the part of first responders, public safety, in a way that ensures the safety and well-being of the community. Of course, you wouldn't think that you would have to need outside capital to come and motivate that, but you take it where you can get it. We live in a moment where in the community that I've called home, South Los Angeles, for 15 years, and I've grown up with family and in different parts of the hood, married a woman from Jordan Downs projects in Watts and so forth. We have a dual sort of consciousness on matters of public safety and police relationships, whereby on the one hand, particularly in the aftermath of George Floyd, people are sick of police officers and law enforcement seeming to step on members of the community, while at the same time lamenting the fact that police are not responsive enough, because the reality of crime on the street level is that it hurts people who are the most vulnerable. I had a very biting experience with this just recently. Like I said, I sort of live on the outskirts of the hood. But I had a neighbor who was shot and killed a couple of weeks ago. He's actually the boyfriend of the person who's actually my neighbor. But they're both like neighbors. I mean, I've known them for years and years without ever asking many questions about, sort of what they did and so forth. And discovered in the aftermath of his killing that this was an individual who dealt drugs and had done so for a long time. And rumors began to circulate that this was a person who had some stash, cash or what have you, in the very home that sits right by where me and my family live. Well, we were told to expect that there might be the potential for a break-in at this property. Sure enough, it happened within several days of this individual's death. I called 911 and was told that police would send somebody to respond as soon as they were able, because I could look and see that there was unauthorized activity on the premise. I'm thinking within 5 or 10 minutes I'll hear sirens. An hour later, there was nothing. Then 2 hours. I called back 2 times, then 3 times. At a certain point, was told that within 20 minutes we would have a response. Ultimately, nobody came. And so I am in the privileged position of actually having personal relationships with law enforcement, not in the bureau in which I live, but at the 77th precinct near a school that I sit on the board of directors for. So I reached out to personal friends of mine in law enforcement. And they were good enough to connect me to an officer who helped lead gang enforcement in the area, a person who told me that as long as I called their number, not 911, but as long as I called them directly, that between the hours of noon to 9, they could make sure somebody was out. Now, that gave me some limited peace of mind. But imagine living in a situation, in a context where you have to have the hookup, basically, to ensure the responsiveness of officers in your community. And yet, I think that part of what many of us feel is that the lack of responsiveness here is in part a consequence of a perception of overactive policing that in turn is leading to a drawing back through police defunding, et cetera, that is making real people more vulnerable. And I want to tie all of this to broken windows theory here, because on the one hand, I think we are wrestling with the tension whereby an engaged culture of law enforcement would seem necessary to creating the preconditions for public safety. And on the other hand, we are dealing with the perception issue where the more engaged law enforcement seems to be, the more easy it is to perhaps recast the public perception of police and of our officers in a way that makes it very easy to seem like policing itself is fundamentally the problem. And so with that preamble, I want to turn to the folks on the stage here to respond to that very sort of tension. Sheriff, I'd like to start with you, since you have the perspective of law enforcement. Is there, am I right in feeling that there is an intractable sort of tension in the way in which we tend to talk about policing, whereby we are not easily able to identify the need for a greater police presence in places where it may be needed, for fear of the fact that these will lead to isolated incidents, of George Floyd, et cetera, that make it easy to paint all of law enforcement with a singular brush?
Well, And I think that's exactly what's happening right now is where you hear about the negative aspects of policing, afraid about being the next viral video. But I would tell you, I've had the privilege, 35 years of the San Diego Police Department, joined it in 1982, retired as the chief of police. And during that time, I also worked undercover for 9 years, so I had a lot of opportunity to speak and interact with those who commit crimes and those who are victims of crimes. And I will tell you, talking with tens of thousands during that career of our community members, of our neighbors, right, throughout the city of San Diego, and I'm sure it's like that in most police departments. And I think it was brought up before in the other panel. Communities, they want police officers, okay? They want more police officers, often in the communities that are victimized more with crime, and that's often some of our most diverse neighborhoods, but they also want better policing. And when you brought up the point where you said that you didn't get a response now, there could be a lot of reasons for that. We talked about the diminished resources that police departments have now, how many hundreds of officers that are down in staffing, and so response times are growing, because you bring up a great point. So what happened? There was a lack of trust now. There was a lot of reasons why you thought, well, why didn't the police show up? Is it because they don't want to come? Or was it they didn't have the staffing and they want to come and they want to do good work? So it's never as simple as to say this or that. It is, many multifaceted policing right now, particularly in the climate that we're seeing.
Yeah.
Can I add a little bit
Yes,
to
you
that?
can. Then I've got a question for you, too,
So,
Mr. Ross.
so I'm here on behalf of Californians Against Retail and Residential Theft. We have a coalition of hundreds of members, primarily small and ethnic businesses, but we're also large trade associations, and we deal with crime victims. We see the frustration. Our members have frustration when they try and reach out to law enforcement and don't always hear back. But their frustration isn't with law enforcement. Their frustration is with the law. Currently, we've changed the laws over time here in California, where we've decriminalized quite a bit of different things. Prop 47 to us is one of the biggest things we've done, where we've made a lot of thefts that used to be felonies now to misdemeanors. And by lowering that threshold, it means when a law enforcement does show up, they know they're writing basically a fix-it ticket. We're going to give them a ticket, and they're probably going to be released. Our members see it all the time. And so that's one of their biggest frustrations. It's not with law enforcement. It's not with the prosecutors. It's with the way the laws are currently written. And the scary thing is, if you go, and if I decide to steal $925 from that table, then come to this table and steal $925, steal $925, $925, $925, $925, $925, I'm going to get written up for a couple tickets for misdemeanor. They don't aggregate all of that and say that's a felony now. I'm under the threshold. So this is how this law works, which makes frustration for me, because person walks in, takes 1 day, comes back, or even comes back an hour later. It's a different problem at that time.
And I'm just going to chime in a little more on that, too. So if you think back to Proposition 47, what was that, 2014?
2014.
2014. So we're talking, almost 10 years. And what was the ballot measure's title? Remember? Anyway?
Neighborhoods and schools.
Yeah, exactly right. Safe Neighborhoods and School Act. So when I have an opportunity, and I speak all over, and particularly now in California, and they talk about that. They talk about why isn't anyone addressing the open-air drug markets that we see, and people that are using dangerous drugs or continuing to go in and steal under $950. And I ask them this question: how did you vote on Prop 47? All right, well, what's Prop 47? Oh, do you remember something called the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Act? Yeah, who doesn't want safe neighborhoods and schools, right? Everyone. So it was, and how many people actually read the ballot measures, or do they just look at the title? Again, so the frustration is, I think, on everyone. And I would tell you, I'm just going to say this right now, 35 years as a proud San Diego police officer, I get asked this question. Thank you. I get asked this question all the time. Would I do it again? Absolutely. It's an honorable and noble profession, and I would do it again and sign up again tomorrow.
Knowing how to name a piece of legislation in a way that suggests it does the exact opposite of what it actually does, unfortunately, seems to be just the mark of a good political consultant these days. But whether it's there you go. But Ms. Ross, I want to ask you a question. Then I want to come to you, Mr. Deputy Attorney. But Just very quickly, just with respect to the larger public conversation that we tend to have on big, weighty issues, such as the idea of systemic racism, let's say. You know, there's larger sorts of cultural, political dialogues that are happening that crisscross a number of issues. But it's interesting to see how, in that environment, anything that would seem to have a disproportionately negative impact on communities of color, where for any number of reasons you might have more, let's say, retail theft as an example of something, is looked at on the basis of that as being a racist policy, even if the benefit is disproportionately to communities of color that might benefit from there being enforcement of the law. How difficult is it for you in your role as an activist to penetrate the public conversation in a way that recenters the need for the rule of law, right? On this particular issue set when you've got this larger conversational environment, which tends to mischaracterize things.
I feel sorry for all these people here because they're actually dealing with normalcy. I actually live in Sacramento, so I live in a world of crazy. But I will tell you, what I try to explain to people is what we see this increase in crime, and not just retail theft, it's now leading to more violence in our stores. As a matter of fact, the National Retailers Federation said that 88% of retailers are now reporting shoplifters are more aggressive. Yeah. So that aggression does not only go to the store owner, it goes to the employees. Well, who are the employees in those stores? Yeah. If you're in a community of color, they're people of color. So those are the folks who are facing it. So what I always like to point out to people is this is impacting everybody within society. We are impacting the store owner, we're impacting the employee, we're impacting the customers who are coming in. And as the more they see problems, the more likely they are not going to come back to the store anymore. So we're impacting that as well. I also think we are doing a disservice actually to the criminal. We allow them to repeat again and again and again and never address the root cause of why they're there. That's what we need to focus on, is why are they here in the first place? More likely than not, I'm sure the police chief would agree, it is a drug problem, it's an alcohol problem, it's some sort of substance abuse, or it's mental health. Yeah. And if we just keep giving them fix-it tickets, what are they doing? They'll be back tomorrow to steal more so they can go buy more drugs. And if you look at our crimes, if you look at our data that you've looked over since 2014, our death rate for those with drug overdoses has more than doubled. Mm-hmm. More than doubled. So what are we doing? We're basically quitting on a group of people and saying, we'll just let you die, rather than sending a message that we need you to go to rehab. We need you to go to rehab, and this is your final spot. I don't know if others have had family members who have had addiction. Unfortunately, I've had that in my family. And there's usually that point in time, if you're going to really go through rehab, you have to hit rock bottom. That rock bottom may be the family cuts you out. Rock bottom may be you get arrested. Rock bottom may be you are being sent to jail. Yeah. But there's usually that rock bottom moment. We're not getting rock bottom moments anymore for people. So the only rock bottom moment is either they see someone die and that gets them to do it, they're near death and that gets them there to go get rehab, or they don't make it. And that to me is the problem. We're not addressing the holistic part of the problem.
Right.
And I'll let you in 1 second, but I do have, sorry.
But
please.
You know, here you talk.
Join the conversation.
You talk about the drug problem. So Prop 47, again, what a lot of people I don't think realize, there was a very successful program, and it's still in place, but it was drug court. Okay? I had the privilege of speaking at many of the drug court's graduations in San Diego. And then, because they had a felony for possession of methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, PCP, dangerous drugs, is that they were given a choice, is that you can go to drug court or you can face a felony charge. I think the district attorney will talk to us about that. And so what that Prop 47 did, basically, because once you're, when you're addicted, it's very difficult, all right, to get off of those drugs. It's not an easy thing to do, but drug court was very successful, and many were able to get off of the drugs and become very much productive members of our society. Drug court basically is non-existent now. So they literally, by this proposition, took a program that was very successful, and they now made it unsuccessful.
Mr. McKinney, you've been very patient, so
Yes.
I want to actually.
Sorry.
I want to actually.
We'll take a break over here.
There you go. I want to actually fire two in a row your way. But to start with, so one frequent complaint and actually I think very difficult reality of certainly inner city life for many people is the fact that historically at least, you do have a higher frequency of arrests and penalties, even for sort of recreational marijuana use and things that might seem to be sort of lower level offenses in the eyes of others that contribute to this idea that there's a larger sort of policing bias against communities of color, given the fact that usage rates of all sorts of recreational substances, including marijuana, which of course is now essentially legal in the state of California, but that these usage rates are essentially the same, but arrest rates and negative interactions with the police and communities of color tends to be much higher. But there's a reason for that insofar as, a la broken windows theory, enforcing certain penalties on certain lower level infractions creates the context to be able to find individuals who may be guilty of much more heinous and consequential offenses. But my question to you, Mr. McKinney, is that does it work out that way in practice, in your view? Do these sorts of policies, do they put you in a position to be able to do your job more effectively as a district attorney? Or should we be looking at this in a different way?
Well, first of all, thank you all for having me here. And John, we have a lot in common. I actually live in South LA myself,
Okay.
on the outskirts because I'm up in Baldwin Hills.
Yeah.
So I'm very familiar with the neighborhood that you spoke of earlier. And I agree with everything that's been said to my left thus far. You all would make great prosecutors, I think, if you decided to change professions. I'm a big believer in the broken windows theory of law enforcement. And I am because I saw it firsthand growing up in a high crime, low income community. And we lived next to a city that was middle class, solidly middle class. And just going from my city to the next city changed my whole disposition. As soon as you crossed that line and everything was cleaner and more orderly, it changed the way you thought about yourself and envisioned yourself in the space you were in.
Right.
So whereas you might have littered in your own neighborhood, all of a sudden you're in a neighborhood where there's no trash on the ground, you're looking for a trash can and boom, there's a trash can every 15 feet. That's a small example of how it changes the way people think, but it's those small things that in the aggregate are important. Now, more to your point, is there a rub between proactive policing of the smaller infractions and over-policing, where people feel as though they're being picked on?
Right.
The answer is yes. There is a rub there. People in the community in which we live, especially in the lower income parts of South LA, I agree, want police officers. There's no question about it. But they also want the respect that they perceive that people, say, in Brentwood get from those very same police officers. They want, someone said they want good policing or something to that effect, better policing. The question, whatever you hear on TV from the talking heads is usually disconnected from what people in the community actually think. If you go to South LA, East LA, and talk to people, they appreciate their police officers, but they want the respect that they deserve from policing. The rub for police officers, this may be a little more appropriate for you to address, is how do we police a community where we are more saturated, and for good reason, because crime is higher here? How do we police that community without the community feeling as though they're being targeted and picked on?
Right.
Is there a possibility to show some grace for some of these smaller infractions as opposed to write the ticket for every single one? As a prosecutor, once cases come to us, under normal circumstances, as opposed to what's going on in our jurisdiction in LA County right now, where we're not even allowed to prosecute many of these crimes. But under normal circumstances, we're looking at the police report to identify a crime, if you will, whether we can prove a particular person did it. And then we ask the larger question, is this something we should prosecute or is it de minimis?
Right.
And a reasonable person should be able to make that decision. But I think we have to be careful, even people like me who believe in the theory and believe in the practice and believe in proactive policing, that has to be balanced against the rights of the community, because they are going to be your best assets in creating a safe environment. You want the community to be part of the team, or you want the police to be part of the community, however you look at it.
Yeah.
You
I
bring
do
up-
have a follow-up for you, John, but yes, let's jump to
You
Shelley,
bring
because
up
I'd love to
excellent,
hear
excellent
you.
points. And, you have the spirit of the law, and you have versus the letter of the law. And that's where discretion comes in. And, that, I will tell you, and I think you would agree, is that there's a very small percentage of society that commit crime.
Yeah.
And an even smaller percentage that commit violent crime. So the challenges for police is to, again, with that small percentage, is to focus on that small percentage. I heard this analogy. It's like, do not go fishing with a huge net, fishing net. You may have to use the spear for that singular individual that's out there committing the crime.
Indeed. Now, John, has your experience in the district attorney's office shifted in the post-George Floyd era? Is there a way in which the aggregate sort of pressures of the conversation are calling upon DAs in some sense to pull back? Obviously, we know that penalties have been reduced for a series of offenses, but how is that manifested in your experience in your role?
Well, it's a tough question. Well, let me see if I can parse it a little bit, because the death of George Floyd coincided closely with us getting a new DA who implemented some radically different policies from what we were doing in the past.
Right.
Let me assume, if I could, that the DA policies remain constant after George Floyd and what I would consider normal, within normal range. I do think the conversation around aggressive policing still would have been a big issue, right? Because that's why we lost our last DA. Primarily, it was a feeling that she wasn't holding police accountable, especially for some officer-involved shootings and other uses of force, serious uses of force. And in my talking to people lately, especially in the Black community, that's a major issue there. And whether it's backed up by statistics or not, the perception is that there are two standards of justice in the criminal justice system, one for police and one for everybody else. Maybe even a third, one for gang members, where prosecutors are ultra aggressive in prosecuting gang members,
Sure.
looking for any reason to file the case. And then when it comes to police officers, looking for any reason to not file the case. That is the perception out there that we have to deal with, whether we agree with it or not. Perception is just as real as reality sometimes. So under the current administration, though, and these new policies, things are very different. I can give you almost every broken window law that you would commonly reference, mostly misdemeanors or some infractions, are prohibited or precluded from prosecution at this point. And what we're prosecuting today essentially are DUIs and domestic violence batteries. Almost everything else is going unprosecuted or underprosecuted, especially for juveniles, and juveniles tend to be the most active.
Right.
So it's discouraging when you work in a place like East LA, which is a lower income neighborhood, a lot of hardworking people there who have poured everything into the properties that they have to suffer with loitering of all kinds, even loitering for prostitution. I think recent change in the law just ties the hands of police officers and prosecutors from doing anything to intervene in that activity. And I don't understand it. If you live on a block where people are walking up and down the street half naked and drug dealing is going on, what do you say to those homeowners who live on that street? What do you say to the parents who are trying to raise children on that street?
Or those that are victims of human trafficking.
Absolutely.
The Figueroa corridor, it's a huge issue.
And then, we're not prosecuting any drug possession crimes in LA County right now for any drug, whether it be heroin, cocaine, fentanyl. It's all going unprosecuted. And to Matt's point, when you combine that with Prop 47, which took away our drug courts and all but legalized theft, a lot of which is committed by hardcore drug addicted people who are trying to feed their habit, you have this explosion now in drug-related homelessness on our streets. And we're wondering, how did this happen overnight? Well, this is how it happened. Bad policy and bad law.
Yeah, and cops are always good for stories, particularly undercover cops. And so to your point where we talk about the drug laws, early in my career, long before the TV show, let alone the movies of 21 Jump Street, I went undercover in a high school. Actually, I went undercover in 2 high schools. As a 23-year-old rookie police officer, I literally talked myself into high school without any school transcripts or parents present. Pretty frightening if you think about that. I tell you this for 2 reasons. Is that number one is that the kids who were selling and using drugs, they were often very disruptive to the students that wanted to learn at school. And they could care less about, getting good grades or, thinking about going to college or even getting a job. What they cared about was finding ways to get more money, usually by stealing, breaking into homes, and to get more drugs and get high. Now, what did I buy there? We're talking, yes, I bought some marijuana, but I also bought PCP and heroin and cocaine and methamphetamine and LSD. So we're talking, very dangerous drugs. But the second reason why I'm telling you this, I think is very much more important. Over my career, I've heard from many of those students and others over the years who I arrested. But one just contacted me, one of the students, now this is almost 40 years ago, contacted me just a couple months ago. And here's why he contacted me, is that he said because I arrested him, it saved his life. He stopped using drugs, okay? He became successful, he married, he had a couple kids, but he reached out to me because he was just blessed with his first grandchild. And so after 40 years, he made sure to find me and contacted me and said, it was because of that arrest, that intervention early in his life that changed his life for the better. And I think it goes to what we're saying, is that, yeah, we have to have a balance, but intervention doesn't necessarily mean going to jail. It might mean going to drug rehab. It might mean a lot of things. But there has to be consequences for actions. And this is what we're not seeing right now, is consequences for actions. You just brought this up, that we're not prosecuting drug crimes. The legislation that was SB 357, I wrote a recent op-ed on that. One of the other assignments I had was that I was an undercover vice detective, which meant that I worked undercover as a prostitute. And so I had the opportunity to obviously arrest pimps, but also to talk with so many victims of human trafficking and the negative consequences that bring crime and disorder into the neighborhoods. So as we say, elections matter.
Shelley, I hope you have a book coming out. 'Cause you have some interesting stories to tell.
There you go. We'll set up a table in the back if you've got a few. Actually, Shelley, in the previous panel, one of our speakers made what I thought was a really interesting and important philosophical point, which is to say that there is a vision of law enforcement as appropriately existing to reinforce and provide support to the cultural and social norms that are pre-existing in a given community. I think that most of us can agree that the idea that police officers need to wear 2 and 3 different hats, essentially as social workers and psychologists and any number of other things, would seem to be untenable. And yet, I think that there is a reason for the great hope that many people invest in the idea of community policing, right? And so I happen to know and think very highly of Deputy Sheriff Amata Tingarides, who, John, I imagine you probably know. And you know her as well. Yes, indeed. And Amata Tingarides is an African-American woman officer who's been with the force many years. She has been something of a superstar to the community as a face of the LAPD. Even I'm sorry, I think I said sheriff before.
You threw me with that one.
Yeah,
No, I was
I'm
looking.
sorry.
I was like,
Now
wow,
I know.
Easy to get them mixed up. Even in a moment where post George Floyd, the overall sort of public perception of even the department in LA has diminished. But I guess my question here, for you, Shelley, but also for anybody who wants to sort of jump into this point, one, should we be investing hope and optimism in the larger idea of community policing? And I would love for you to shine a light on what that means to you. And two, if we should, is there some tension between that and the proactive approach to policing that broken windows theory would seem to call upon us to take seriously?
Yeah, well, it's both. I'm a huge proponent of community policing. You know, get out of your car, talk to someone. You know, and with the problem right now.
Can you define community policing for us?
Yeah, I would tell you, I don't think there's just one definition of it, but it's basically working with the community to address and problem solve together. Okay, what we might think is a problem, you know, as a police officer may not be what the community wants us to focus on. So it's working together, building that trust. As I like to say is that, you know, you need the community support. You know, mentioned Sir Robert Peel, you know, the principles of policing, absolutely. But another one, besides the police addressing crime and disorder, is the police are the public are the police, right? You know, they give us the ability to do our job, and we help the community, again, address issues. So it's problem solving, it's working together, it's about building relationships. And I talk a lot about this when I have opportunities on a leadership talk that I give, is that it's not in policing if something is going to go wrong and you need the community standing with you. It's when something's going to go wrong. You know, statistics put out there, how many, you know, millions of contacts across our country do police officers make? And if you don't have those contacts and relationships built up with your community policing trust beforehand, then you're going to have more problems. And I also say this, too, is that, you know, police officers are not just first responders. Too often we're the only responders to all of society's challenges, and that's wrong. Okay, we need, you know, we talk about, you know, community policing, but we need the entire ecosystem to step up and help the police, because they can't do it alone, nor should we do it alone.
Well, and I'd like to add to that. I think when we talk about law enforcement and how the community thinks, perception is reality.
Right.
When I grew up in West Los Angeles, it was a lower income neighborhood, but on our block we had a sheriff's deputy. So immediately our whole block had a different perception of law enforcement because we knew a law enforcement officer. It changed everything of your perception. Didn't matter your ethnicity, didn't matter your background. That's what everybody thought because we had a law enforcement officer on our street. We also felt like we had the safest street in the world. Like, hey, nothing's going to happen here. You have to go through the sheriff's deputy down the street. When I moved up to Sacramento, I was started in the Attorney General's office, and we had a group of our law enforcement officers who said, hey, we're going to go work at the Police Athletic League, and we're going to go work in Del Paso Heights, which in Sacramento is one of the worst neighborhoods in the area. And the reason why was they wanted to have a contact with the youth. They wanted the youth to have a contact that was positive with law enforcement rather than the first time they see law enforcement, a knock on the door because they're arresting somebody or because they're announcing that, I'm sorry, somebody has died. And so they were trying to change that narrative. I think we need, when you're talking community policing, I think we need police in the community. And the community needs to see them, know them, and have that's going to change your perception. If you only see them because something went wrong, you have a completely different perception of law enforcement than in the more affluent communities when you're seeing them because they live in the community or because you know the one officer who's patrolling your neighborhood. And so I think that's got to change.
If I could jump in, I agree with what has been said. When we hear or think about community policing, we're thinking about the big agencies, NYPD, LAPD, the Sheriff's Department. most of the policing is small town, small city policing, which is almost inherently community-based because most of the people in the community will have contact with a lot of police officers on the force. So for example, when I was a child growing up, I knew a lot of the police officers who worked for the city police department. And we would, and I'm referring to my friends and I, see some of these police officers and get excited, you know, because they were the cool ones. We would see others and go, oh my God, look who's coming. So it's important because, as Shelley said, even though I made the point that some of these small agencies are well known to the community, especially the people who are involved in crime, they know a lot of things that they don't get credit for knowing. They know who the police officers are. You can have a small town police force and still not have community policing because, as Shelley pointed out, the style of policing has to be to collaborate and connect with the community and not just drive around in cars all day waiting for a service call. Right. So I think we're all big supporters of that style of policing.
And so, to take this full loop, so with the vilification of law enforcement, and so we've heard so many don't want to be police officers now, early retirements, which has now means that you go from call to call to call to respond to violent crime. So that's diminished the ability to do community policing. So it is a very bad loop now, like a self-fulfilling prophecy where the community wants more community policing, but actually they're going to get less because there are fewer police officers. So I think it was brought up, how do we now change that to have more people enter the police force, have more people that want to stay, and they need the support. You know, they need the support not just from the department, they need the support from the community. They certainly need the support from the elected officials, and every time they take more tools away, technology, not the ability to go, you know, on a foot pursuit or a vehicle pursuit. And what is that message that sends? You know, words matter and actions matter, okay? And when you say, well, we're not going to trust the police, so we don't want them to have technology, okay? You basically have emboldened those that commit crime and make it more difficult for the police to prevent and respond to crime and then solve crime. And I'll just say this, you know, if you're the victim, there's no acceptable level of crime.
Right. Yeah. I want to ask a question that I rarely hear asked in these sorts of panels, to the panel here. So I read the book and was very impacted by the book Ghetto Side by LA Times reporter Jill Leovy, which is about our part of town, John. And in the book, she essentially traces and analyzed the longer history of the relationship between the Los Angeles Police Department, the local community, and this book was published, I think, 2008, 2009 or so, so it's a little bit dated by now. And what's interesting is that, you know, my sense of the author is that she's somebody who leans left in her politics, but the overwhelming lesson you draw from the book, one of the overwhelming lessons, is that communities do indeed want sufficient policing. They may want better policing, but they want police. They don't want to get rid of the police in general. And yet one of the arguments that she makes very much mirrors the arguments that conservatives tend to make about teachers' unions, which is to say that part of the problem with the educational system is that owing to union practices, oftentimes in less resource-rich areas, the lowest performing teachers tend to be relocated in a way that essentially hides their underperformance at the expense of the students that they serve. And in that book, at least, she argues that not only is the department underfunded in the areas in Los Angeles, at least, where it oftentimes needs the most support, but that oftentimes the most sort of emotionally unintelligent, let's say, officers and lowest performing officers are the ones who are placed in the areas that actually need the most competence in terms of policing, because the higher performing officers are placed in areas where the residents simply have more social and political capital and can demand a higher quality of policing. I've always thought that was an interesting analysis. I mean, John, as you said, I mean, my wife has always told me growing up in the projects, you knew the cops who cared and you knew the cops who didn't care, right? That's what I had always been told. Is this a problem worthy of discussion in your experience, Shelley and John and Ross? Feel free to weigh in, or is this analysis perhaps not as generally true as the book that I read might suggest it is?
I posted something on social media a few weeks ago to this point where I suggested that law enforcement needs to think about how they allocate officers based on their maturity as an officer, such that they're not putting the new officers in the hardest to police communities simply because they're the most junior and they don't get their say as to where they go and they work. A friend of mine who I trust very much, who's also a prosecutor and a reserve officer, said it's a little more complicated than that. Sometimes the newer officers are being placed in these more difficult to police areas with proper training for a reason. I don't remember what reason he gave, but it sounded, I remember it sounding like it was a good reason. But Shelley, you probably could speak more to that.
And you know, again, like most things, there's a lot of nuance to this. You know, go back to the staffing level. So many leaving, and now you have more officers coming on who are inexperienced. So you have a lot of inexperienced officers that are going to go to a lot of different areas. You know, I can only speak for our department. So they're going to go to a lot of different areas, and so we are relying on our more senior officers to make sure that they understand that, you know, as we talked about before with the community policing, to address, you know, you have the spirit of law, letter law, everything that we've spoken about. So I don't know if it's like what you're talking about, that we particularly in one place just put the junior officers in this area. Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily the case, you know, but, you know, could it be for some of the departments? Could be, but I'm concerned about, though, just the inexperienced level, because I'll tell you right now, you get out of the academy, you need to spend at least 2 or 3 years in patrol before you can really think that you have it, that you can really independently go out there and address all the myriad of challenges that you're going to respond to. And so that's a concern with so many officers that are inexperienced. And I'll say this one thing, too, because it goes to this. I'll never forget, I was giving a presentation at City Council, and talking about the difficulties of recruitment and then retention. And one of the city council members made this comment and said, you know, I could help you fix your recruitment, you know, staffing problems. Okay, I'm all theirs. Just lower your standards is basically what he said. And here was I was like, what? And you could almost like hear a gasp from some of the other city council members and the few that were in the audience from the community. And
Right.
Here was my immediate response. I had no idea that he was going to say that, but here it was. As long as I'm chief of police, I will never lower our standards. We should want the very best and brightest to be San Diego police officers. And you know how you can help that? Is that you can make sure that they're the highest paid law enforcement professionals in our county, and they're not. So why don't you help us? You know, so again, it goes to that, is that, you know, it's like everything is put on the police. So we're going to put the least experienced here, or this is what I've heard this is what I've heard there. Boy, we, again, need the support, because that's all negative talk. We need the support of the community, the department, of elected officials to say, we are only going to hire the best and brightest. We're going to pay them. And then we're also going to make sure that they have the tools, the training, the resources and equipment, everything that they need to be successful.
Indeed.
And I can just talk from Sacramento's perspective. I know the county sheriff's department really well. And what we've noticed is every time someone gets a promotion, so your most junior position, or as soon as you start with the department, you go to the jail. So the jail notoriously has the worst problems because that's where we're sending all our most inexperienced officers. The last sheriff decided, I'm sick and tired of this problem, and started to incentivize people to stay at the jail longer with better pay, with talk about promotion faster, so that way he had more experienced people, so some of the problems went away. I think the same could work when you're talking about communities. If they're being underserved, can we provide incentives to maybe get some of those more experienced officers in that locale rather than just letting it being passed off to someone else? I think another thing we tend to do is we just assume people are going to become law enforcement today. And that doesn't seem to be the case. I almost think we need to go to like a GI Bill, You're off to college. You want to get part of your college paid for. You're going to be a law enforcement officer for 2, 3, 4 years. I think you'll get some people in, and once they start, this may become their career, or they may not. But at least you're going to start getting new recruits in the system, and have a better chance to actually have a viable system than what we have going currently.
That perspective feels useful. We're going to go to audience questions in just a couple of minutes, but Matt, I do want to return to you here. You said earlier that perception is reality,
Yes.
right? And I do agree with that, certainly in the sorts of contexts we're referring to. And I'm wondering, even though I think we are all in agreement here that in the vast main, communities want policing. They want a response to the things that actually imperil them as families and individuals and communities. Yet I wonder if, clearly there is some degree of at least perception shift, both of law enforcement itself. There's actually a phenomenon where you can look at various dating sites and see where the term, the acronym ACAB, for folks who know what that stands for, has become something that you more or less want to sort of tag on your dating profile so you'll get more hits from, folks who are activists and I guess, don't want to date people who are backing the blue and so forth. But as a generational matter, both with respect to the perception of law enforcement, but also the idea that it's bad to steal. I just don't have another way of putting it. That this is actually, that property violations are a serious thing, even if it's not the same thing as taking a life.
Right.
But, do you have the sense that among young people that, maybe that we should be worried about this perception shift? And if so, what are your thoughts about responding to that?
I definitely think we need to worry about this perception shift because we've got to send the message. We've got to send the message early. Doesn't mean we're throwing them up and locking them behind bars. It means a discussion. It means, how many times as a kid you did something wrong and your neighbor says, I'm going to go talk to your mom. No, don't talk to my mom. I'd rather have a cop talk to me than you talk to my mom, right? Let's start bringing the holistic society back. Let's bring the community in to help. Let's bring the school in. Let's start addressing them. There's a small independent chain, roughly 50 stores here in Southern California. They're primarily in some of the poorer communities. This independent chain gets 200 theft notifications a day. A day, he gets theft notification after theft notification. They put in all sorts of security measures. They've got locking carts. As soon as you hit the door, if you haven't paid for anything, the cart's locked. They've got cameras, they've got other things. But his first rule of thumb is, I don't want any of my employees to confront anyone who's stealing. Because he's afraid they're going to get hurt or customers are going to get hurt, and he has no idea what's going to happen. But he's doing everything else he can to make it safe. But he is also talking to parents if he sees a kid coming in. He wants the parents to understand, your son's stealing, your daughter's taking things that they shouldn't be taking. You should know about it.
Yeah.
We've passed it on to law enforcement, and most of the time, once again, if we're in LA County, nothing's happening with it. But we're letting them know so that way we can start addressing the problem, the root cause, which is we've got to start at the early age to let people know this is not right. This is not what we want. I'm also hopeful. I'm one of those guys who believes that pendulum is finally starting to swing the other way. And so I just want to leave. I know we're going to switch to other things in a little bit, but I just want to talk a little bit about some hope. So more local governments are taking steps on their own, putting license plate readers in high traffic areas. City of Lakewood actually hired security guards. And security guards are working with their police officers because the sheriff's department couldn't provide them any more officers.
Right.
They were tapped out. So they're finding ways to get around, and they're putting them in high traffic areas to try and deal with some of the crime problems they have. In Oakland, more than 200 businesses went on strike. When have you heard of a business going on strike? They went on strike because theft was such a problem in a 5-block radius. They said, we're shutting down for half the day to send a message to the city, we need to do something now. Right. I think those are the types of things that are moving that pendulum. I think we finally saw some changes in laws over the last 2 months even. We have not in the last decade expanded 3 strikes laws in any way, shape, or form until this year. They finally said, you know what, if you human traffic, it's a 3rd strike. So we finally said that's so bad it could be a strikeable offense. But before this, it was not. I mean, it's amazing to think that we could buy and sell people,
Yeah.
and that was allowed, right? Fentanyl has,
It was a fight to get that passed.
but it got there. And now there's fentanyl possession. Fentanyl is now considered a hard drug. These are all changes that happened this year that we have not seen in the last decade. The last thing I kind of want to leave everybody with is there's an initiative that's supposed to qualify today to start collecting signatures. It's not qualified for the ballot, they're going to start collecting signatures. For my folks, they're happy because they're going to start addressing retail theft. What they're saying is if you've committed a misdemeanor 2 or more times on that third offense, you can be treated as a felon. The thing I found really interesting is they want to do multiple convictions on drug possession. If you are drug possession multiple times, they're calling something called mandated felony treatment. So that means you must go to treatment and we'll eradicate your felony. But if you don't go to treatment, if you don't try and get better like drug courts try to, and by the way, drug courts, if you've ever been, they know you're going to fail a couple times. They know it's not going to pass day one. They give you a couple chances, but they want you to keep working at it. But if you don't do that, then you're going to prison. So these are some things I think are hopeful. We're seeing some changes. We're seeing them move a little bit. We're seeing the public starting to speak out. I think those are all good things. I think we're seeing the legislature finally moving just a little bit of a needle. I don't think it's ever going to come back to where we were in the 80s and 90s, but I think that pendulum's finally starting to swing. It may stop soon, but at least it's moving, I think, in the right direction.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
You're
Matt.
welcome.
And let's have a round of applause for our panel.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And now let's keep the conversation going involving all of you. And I think we've got about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. And so the first hand I saw was in the back here. Lady in the blue. Yes, indeed.
Thank you, that was such a good overview. To speak to what you just ended on, which is some hopeful signs, and Ms. Zimmerman, what you said, which is words matter, I can't help but go back to the wording of Proposition 47.
Yes.
I mean, that to me should be a crime. The lack of transparency, really trickery
Yep.
in terms of trying to get these laws passed. Are there any initiatives to create, accountability and make these propositions really say what they mean?
There is talk of an initiative to take the title and summary away from the secretary, or take it away from the attorney general and move it to the legislative analyst's office. You have to remember, the trickery works both ways. The people who are proposing the initiative write up their own title as well, and then hope it gets cleared.
But like in consumer law, if I went to buy a yellow Chevy
Right?
and they go great and they gave me a red one, I mean, I would have a case. How is it that as voters, we're being given a version of reality that is incorrect or non-transparent? It seems that should not be.
You're at, once again,
Agree.
you're talking logic
Agree.
and
Common
you're talking
sense.
state
Common
government, and
sense.
those two
Yeah.
don't always coexist. And,
But hopefully we can work that out because otherwise this is the effect.
yeah, but here's the, I hate to say this is the biggest problem. So to get something on the ballot, it's realistically an $8 to $10 million expense to go gather all those signatures to get it placed on the ballot. Who's the ones to spend $8 to $10 million to say we should actually say the right thing on a ballot initiative? Who's going to write that check? So if you can find that person, I'll be happy to help them and point them to who will help gather signatures because there's plenty of people who support it. But it's coming up with the money. Just because you have a good idea doesn't always mean it's financed. Just like we've had talk about changing 47 a couple times. The first couple times we got a little bit of money, but not enough really to get over the end. And then they were going to do a proposal, I think 2 or 3 years ago. That failed because they just didn't have any money to do signature gathering. The proposal I'm talking about today is just getting out of the Attorney General's office. Now it's going to be collecting signatures. So if the money shows up, it will be on the November ballot. If the money doesn't show up, I just talked about it and it went away.
You know,
Thank you, Matt.
you talk about being a voter. It's not enough to be a voter. You have to be an informed voter.
Indeed. I'm going to go to the gentleman in the black here. Yes, sir.
To put this in the paradigm or the context of broken windows, the police don't fix the windows.
Right.
They can apprehend whoever's doing it, stop people from doing it. The police don't remove graffiti. They don't clean up homeless encampments. down, particularly in the city of Los Angeles, is that the police department has become isolated by the politicians. And the other departments, the Public Works Department and various other people who would actually fix these windows or remediate these problems, have been kind of separated from and told, you really don't need to cooperate with the police here
Right.
so much. And so all the good efforts of the police are being subverted by the politicians, the city council, essentially, taking all these other departments and defunding the departments or kind of changing their mission to the point that the broken windows paradigm or theory can't be implemented because it takes more than the police. Yet all the criticism and everything comes back on the police. Why aren't you fixing these things?
Right.
It's not the police who fix the window. So this is a sort of revelation or education, something that everyone should be putting back out here. You know, we'll do everything we can. We, the police, you know, we don't appreciate being defunded, but we have many partners here in this municipal government who we depend on to implement our law enforcement, to implement our community engagement. We're going to turn this over to people. We need a whole team of city employees, essentially, to come in and remove a whole block of, or multiple blocks of homeless encampments that are housing or protecting abused children, abused trafficked women,
Right.
drug dealers typically live in a house not too far from these places, and they, on a daily or hourly basis, circulate among, do their drug dealing and so on. They live, you know, a block away in most cases. So if you want to clean one of these things out, the police can't just go in
Eric,
and
let-
arrest this guy.
So
Let's
if I-
let's allow the panel
Can
to
I talk a little bit
respond.
about,
There's a lot there.
you know, we talked about a little bit about homelessness. Let me just make this comment. There are a lot of reasons why, and everybody has their own individual story on why they became homeless. But I'm going to break it down into three categories. You have the have-nots, the can-nots, and the will-nots. The have-nots are individuals, they don't have enough. Okay, it's very expensive to live in California. Maybe they lost a job, maybe somebody got sick, maybe, you know, they just don't have enough. And we have to do everything as a society that we can to make sure that they do have enough that they don't become homeless. Then you have the can-nots that I believe are probably the greatest percentage. And those are those that are drug addicted, mental health issues. They cannot function. They cannot function on the streets. They cannot function in a house. They certainly can't function to have a job. And then you have the will-nots. And those are individuals that do not believe that the rule of law applies to them. And we must enforce. So you have, let's do everything we can to prevent somebody from being homeless, the have-nots, the can-nots. We must intervene for their own health, safety, and welfare, and the health, safety, and welfare of the community at large. And then we must enforce on the will-nots.
And I want to go to kind of your statement from our keynote address. I thought kind of really hit it nail on the head when he says, we've been raising the transactional costs to enforce the law. We've been lowering the transactional costs to break the law. We need to flip that. That's what we need to do. We need to change that. And once we start changing that, everything else will start coming into place.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question for the chief. I'm very involved with a civil rights organization for many years in Compton. Compton is patrolled by a certain law enforcement agency in LA, the same law enforcement agency that patrols my neighborhood. But for some reason, I'm wondering about the allocation of resources, because, for example, the street crime takeovers with the street takeovers in Compton, people are getting killed. Of course, Gascon is not filing those cases. He's waiting for the rich white kid in Malibu that kills all of the beautiful young college girls down the street here because he's in a tight re-election race. But what happens in Compton is these street takeovers are fueled by drugs, gangs. I know personally a woman whose brother was killed on the front yard of his lawn. How do I, in my potential position, get law enforcement to be more responsive to Compton to to put the resources for those street takeovers, because in my neighborhood where the same law enforcement agency patrols, that would never be allowed to happen. How do I make that shift in their mindset to get those resources where they need to go?
Yeah, it could be the street takeovers, it could be anything, and we've talked about, how do we get police to respond to what we need them to respond to. Obviously organize. Obviously, not just you, but you need to get more individuals. The more individuals that make that request of, get to meet with the whoever's the chief of that area or the captain or whoever is in charge of the area, absolutely get your other city council or the mayors or whoever you can, the community leaders involved. And I think the more coalition that you have together to say, well, this is a priority for our community, the greater likelihood that something could be done.
Okay, very good. Pete, do we have time for one more?
One more.
One more. Okay. Who's that lucky one going to be here?
Can I follow up then on that last comment?
You may, Ms. McGinney.
Our laws are, among other things, value statements. We make laws to protect people and places that we care about. And we expect that when we pass a law, it's going to be given effect, that police officers are going to do proper enforcement investigations, and then turn that over to a district attorney who's going to do something more than chuck it in the trash. Without the district attorney doing his job, it doesn't matter what law enforcement does.
It's true.
It doesn't matter how many communities install license plate readers and cameras and spend a lot of money trying to help the police with the investigation side. The buck stops with the district attorney. The district attorney has to be relied on to enforce the law in a fair, legal, and ethical way. And we don't have that now in Los Angeles County. And there's a debate about that, I should say. There's a debate about whether we have that now in Los Angeles County. It's my opinion that we don't. To Deborah's point about the street racing occurring in Compton, I'm not an expert on the street racing, but I think these young people, they pick one of two places to do this activity. One is they pick iconic places that will make for good video on Instagram. So they love to go to the 6th Street Bridge, which is a beautifully redesigned bridge downtown, and get amazing shots, with the city in the background. That's predictable. Like LAPD should just sit on the 6th Street Bridge every night. And then they go to places where they assess law enforcement doesn't care as much about, or the residents in that area don't care as much about. And that goes right to the heart of the whole broken policing, broken windows theory, is that if we let these small things fester, they send a message that these places aren't cared about. So if you're criminally minded, you should go here to do your crime because the police are overlooking that area. They're not responding to that area. So although Compton is probably much more heavily policed, and I don't know where Deborah lives, but certainly some other areas where that law enforcement agency, we're talking about the sheriff's department,
I didn't name them.
they operate more, they have more resources in Compton than other areas, yet we still see higher crime in Compton than some of the other areas. So the sheriff would probably say, look, I've got a lot of resources. I got a station in Compton. Still, we're there because this is an area where this community, this society, the problems that exist here are sending a message to people who are inclined to break the law that this is a fertile ground to do it. That's something that we have to all care about. We have to really start to see ourselves as one community, not these balkanized, places where some imaginary line separates Beverly Hills from West LA or South LA. We're one people. What affects one part of our community should be felt in the other part of the community.
So to
Indeed.
follow up
John
on that,
John McKinney, Shelley's, I'm so sorry. I think we are at time at this point.
I was just going to
But-
ask, is the district attorney, assuming it's the same district attorney, prosecuting those crimes no matter where they are?
He's not prosecuting all of the crimes in the penal code. He has explicitly prohibited the prosecution of many crimes.
Well, specifically though.
The street racing,
yeah.
I do think we are filing those cases. I don't know the specific case that Deborah referred to, or a murder or killing that occurred, and whether it was a murder or not.
Okay. John, Shelley, Matt, it's
Easy
a pleasure.
accident by your boss.
Okay. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to the three of you, to be able to learn from the three of you, and to be with all of you here. One more time, round of applause for our panel.